There's a conspiracy theory that follows Haing Ngor, even now nearly 30 years after his death. It's the idea that in 1996, Khmer Rouge leader Pol Pot sent agents to Los Angeles to assassinate him. It's a tempting theory. After all, Ngor starred in the movie The Killing Fields, which exposed the Khmer Rouge for the genocidal maniacs that they were. Ngor was also using his fame to push for a human rights tribunal to hold Khmer Rouge leaders accountable for crimes against humanity, the millions of deaths they caused. To me, the idea that the Khmer Rouge killed Ngor is exactly that, a conspiracy theory, urban legend. But the glue that holds it together is real. It's the unprocessed trauma that many survivors of the Khmer Rouge still carry, even decades later and continents away from 1970s Cambodia. My name is Patricia Noonan, and this is Who Killed Haing Ngor? Investigating Ngor's murder means eliminating motives and suspects, and I'm about to eliminate a big one. So, who were the Khmer Rouge, and why does this theory still linger? First, a warning. This episode will include scenes of Khmer Rouge brutality and torture. Here's how I explain who the Khmer Rouge were to people new to the subject. The Khmer Rouge were the ISIS of the 1970s. Most of us remember how ISIS, or the Islamic State, took over parts of Syria and Iraq in 2014 and declared it a caliphate. ISIS extremists told themselves that they were creating a, quote, pure Islamic State. Their brutality amounted to crimes against humanity. The Khmer Rouge were also obsessed with purity, but their revolution wasn't about religion. This was the 1970s. It was about communism. And their brutality was just as intense.
When people say to me, it couldn't have been that bad, I said the reality was much worse.
Susan Walker is a veteran humanitarian affairs advisor. She began her career as an aid worker with the American Refugee Committee during the worst of Cambodia's refugee crisis. That means she heard stories of Khmer Rouge cruelty directly from survivors. Here's what happened once when two young people fell in love.
The couple was put in the middle of this youth camp that the Khmer Rouge had taken people. They would put ropes around their neck, and all the other kids had to walk around and kill until the boy and the girl were killed. How do you survive from that? Banging babies against trees until they die. How do you survive that? Gutting pregnant women and then banging the fetus against the tree. How do you recover from that?
Khmer Rouge goals were delusional. They thought their revolution would create a utopian, classless, communist society. It was really just a gruesome and warped attempt at social engineering, backed by fanatical violence. Khmer is the dominant ethnicity in Cambodia. Rouge, of course, is French for red. So the name literally means Red Khmers, a reference to communism. When they seized control, they marched everyone out of the cities at gunpoint and into forced labor camps. That's an entire population of 7 or 8 million people suddenly made into prisoners. Then they filtered people. Rice farmers were the proletariat, the most pure Khmers, with whom they could build a new society. Then the Khmer Rouge executed educated people, the entire professional class, for the crime of being bourgeois. That's why a doctor like Ngor had to pretend he was uneducated. The same was true for Dith Pran, the New York Times reporter that he later played in The Killing Fields. The Khmer Rouge were also seriously paranoid. They tortured anyone they thought broke a rule or was somehow disloyal to the revolution. Pol Pot, the Khmer Rouge leader, was revered but rarely ever seen.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I feel happy.
This is Ngor in 1985. That's the year after The Killing Fields came out. This is what he said to high school students, believe it or not, at Punahou School in Honolulu, Hawaii.
He tied it up over here, both sides of hands tied up, and both legs hang up crucifixion style, like Jesus Christ, and start fire in the bottom for 3 nights, 4 days.
Ngor's accent can be tough to follow, so if you didn't get that, the Khmer Rouge strung him up on a cross, crucifixion style, and burned a fire beneath him for 3 nights and 4 days. That wasn't the only time Ngor was tortured. We'll hear more about his experiences in an upcoming episode. It gets even more bizarre. The Khmer Rouge thought their revolution was so pure that they had reset the calendar to year 0. They banned money, private property, books, film, music, religion, all signs of a, quote, corrupt capitalist society. They took a reasonably modern country and tried to brutalize it into a pre-industrial Eden. It was a catastrophic failure.
I bury my mother.
I lost for
My sister.
2 young.
You know how Americans can tell you where they were on September 11th, 2001?
My whole family remained in Phnom Penh at the time. My parents, 5 sisters, 2 brothers. In fact, my whole family. I don't have any idea.
In Cambodia, anyone who lived between 1975 and 1979 can list the family members they lost to the Khmer Rouge. It sometimes goes into the dozens.
Starvation, disease, hard labor.
I think we are not alone.
Hundreds of thousands of people escaped to refugee camps along the border between Cambodia and Thailand. At least 2 million people died during the Khmer Rouge years. That's according to DCCAM, a Cambodian non-governmental organization that documents the atrocities. That's at least a quarter of the population. Pol Pot hardly ever gets mentioned in American classrooms, but he stands alongside Hitler, Stalin, and Mao as one of the most murderous war criminals of the 20th century. That gives you an idea of the Khmer Rouge brutality, but you need a little more history. Cambodia borders with Vietnam, where in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the U.S. was busy losing a war. The North Vietnamese routinely crisscrossed the border to run supplies to their fighters further south. In response, the U.S. carpet-bombed the Cambodian countryside in an attempt to wipe out those supply lines. This was President Richard Nixon and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, to be precise. This was the Cold War, and Cambodia's leader, Prince Norodom Sihanouk, had declared the nation's neutrality. But in 1970, he was ousted in a coup d'etat. Many believe that the coup was orchestrated by the CIA, but there's technically still debate around that point.
So on May 1st, 1970, Nixon ordered the invasion of Cambodia to destroy North Vietnamese
Still,
supply and
that same year, the U.S. military illegally invaded Cambodia. Once again, this was President Nixon trying to win in Vietnam. The Khmer Rouge had been a small, homegrown communist insurgency, but Prince Sihanouk was so angry about the coup that he urged young Cambodians to join them. Hundreds of thousands did exactly that. Now let's circle back to Haing Ngor. As I said, the Khmer Rouge were obsessed with purity. Any traitors to the revolution, real or imagined, had to be purged. One Khmer Rouge officer was largely in charge of those purges, removing traitors from the ranks, Comrade Doik. His real name was Keng Gek Uv. He ran a prison called Tuol Sleng, or S21. That's where disloyal Khmer Rouge and other unfortunate souls were tortured. Most were later executed. This audio is from 2009. Haing Ngor has been dead for 13 years at this point, but one of his wishes came true. Surviving Khmer Rouge leaders went to trial for war crimes. The first to testify was Comrade Doik. It's a long story, but he cooperated with the prosecution.
If we talk about Pol Pot, he was the highest person. He really designed the theory and the line to destroy, to kill people heinously.
Duic's testimony is being translated by the tribunal's interpreter.
I believe that Pol Pot used a kind of trick used by Stalin when he killed Trotsky in order to kill Haing S and me and my wife. Luckily, I survived. Unfortunately, my wife died. Haing S was killed because he appeared in the film The Killing Field.
Duic testified with zero evidence that Khmer Rouge leader Pol Pot ordered the assassination of Haing Ngor in Los Angeles. That one line of testimony made headlines around the world. It reignited the conspiracy theory that first emerged with Ngor's death in 1996.
There's a great sort of incredible chauvinism amongst a lot of Cambodians. And I think that the whole purpose of these purges was to a constant process of revolution, of purging, of cleansing, of ridding the ranks of enemies. And they were deeply secretive and very, very paranoid.
This is Nick Dunlop. He's an Irish photojournalist who in 1999 found Comrade Duic living in a remote part of Cambodia under an assumed name. That eventually led to Duic's arrest and the 2009 testimony.
And they were convinced that their revolution was unique, that it was the most far-reaching and radical revolution the world had ever seen. And they believed that it was the envy of certainly the communist world. And they were paranoid about the Vietnamese, for instance, undermining that revolution. So, I think the whole idea, the whole concept of being Cambodian or being Khmer and being pure or pure blood was central to the Khmer Rouge thinking.
By 1977, after 2 years in power, the revolution began to devour itself. Purges became so common that mid-level Khmer Rouge officers fled to Vietnam. There, they regrouped. And on January 7, 1979, Vietnam invaded Cambodia, overthrowing the Khmer Rouge. Cambodians call it Liberation Day. But the invasion also ignited the four-way civil war that would grip Cambodia until the 1990s. Pol Pot and other senior leaders disappeared into hiding, commanding their forces from the jungle. Duic vanished too. Dunlop wrote a book about Comrade Duic called The Lost Executioner. He's with me on the conspiracy theory about Ngor's murder. It just doesn't make sense.
If that was under the orders of Pol Pot, you'd wonder, well, why? Of all the Cambodians, why would you go to great lengths to have somebody assassinated in the United States? To what end? To what purpose?
Duic was arrested in 1999. 10 years went by before the opening of the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, officially called the Extraordinary Chambers in the Courts of Cambodia. That gave Duic plenty of time to think. To Dunlop, he was playing for sympathy.
I think the Khmer Rouge were too inward-looking to be that organized, to organize an assassination on the other side of the planet. I just don't think that's possible. At least I think it's highly unlikely. I think it's about, possibly it's about Duic positioning himself closer to the likes of Haing Ngor, who was clearly probably one of the most famous Cambodians after Sihanouk, certainly in the Western. So it was very much for a Western audience. And remember, he was very aware of his audience in court.
One simple reason the conspiracy theory falls apart is timing. The Killing Fields came out in 1984, so why wait 12 years to kill Ngor? Why not kill him in Cambodia? That would be much easier than sending agents to kill him in Los Angeles or even calling on a sympathizer there to do the deed. It also overlooks a mountain of history. As I've said, the Killing Fields helped inspire the peace talks that largely ended the four-way civil war. The Khmer Rouge were one of the groups in that four-way. They signed the peace deal in 1991 alongside everyone else. That then sent a massive United Nations peacekeeping mission to Cambodia, The goal was to hold democratic elections. Now here's a key fact. In 1993, the Khmer Rouge made a huge strategic mistake. They pulled out of the peace deal. They refused to participate in the elections. Their name was not on the ballot. They thought they were undermining the entire UN mission, but they couldn't have been more wrong. The 1993 elections were a fabulous success. The Khmer Rouge had sidelined themselves. Now, technically, the Khmer Rouge still held pockets of territory, and you wouldn't want to run into them. That would probably be fatal. But by the end of 1993, when the UN left, the Khmer Rouge were left sitting in the jungle. The rest of Cambodia blossomed into the future. If you think about it, when I was there in the 1990s, the only images we ever saw of Pol Pot were in black and white. The Khmer Rouge were just this increasingly bizarre relic of the 1970s, and they vibed like the 1950s. The same year Ngor died, in 1996, a senior Khmer Rouge leader named Haing S ended up defecting to the government and brought with him thousands of fighters. The Khmer Rouge were in their death throes. I'm going to throw two more experts at you who also debunk the conspiracy theory. Nate Thayer was one of the world's foremost experts on the Khmer Rouge. In 1999, he accompanied Nick Dunlop in their historic confrontation with Duch. It was Thayer's interview of Duch that eventually led to the War Crimes Tribunal. And I just want to shout out, there's 2 episodes on the full Thayer, Dunlop, and Duch story in my first season. In the last episode, I told you how I'm collaborating with the Innocence Center for this investigation. They're the legal nonprofit that represents one of the wrongfully convicted in the Ngor killing. Most of the time, I work with Frank, the Innocence Center's research consultant. Now, Frank is not Frank's real name. He prefers his privacy when it comes to podcasts. But he's a retired police officer with years of investigative experience in gang violence, especially Asian gang violence in Southern California. He'll come up more as this podcast goes along. This audio is from an interview Frank did with Nate Thayer in 2018. He asked Thayer if the Khmer Rouge could have killed Ngor in L.A.
Operationally, virtually impossible. They certainly would have no control. It's not like they control gangs or criminal gangs. It's not like you can't compare it to, say, like an organized crime here.
Yuk Chang is the executive director of the Documentation Center of Cambodia, better known as DCCAM. It's the non-governmental organization that I mentioned earlier that investigates, collects, and preserves evidence of Khmer Rouge atrocities.
For me, it's not Khmer Rouge assassination.
Right.
Not at all.
Yeah, that's a theory that comes around, and Duch perpetuated that idea.
I think it's easy to blame Khmer Rouge for everything, but sometimes things happen out of the Khmer Rouge context. It's something else.
I could go on detailing the collapse of the Khmer Rouge. In short, after their disastrous decision to withdraw from the UN peace process, the Khmer Rouge spent the next 5 years trying to find a way back into Cambodia's political mainstream. They were desperate to dissociate themselves from the 1970s and the war crimes for which they were renowned. Killing Haing Ngor in 1996 as some sort of belated revenge killing for a movie that had come out 12 years earlier, a figure who was beloved by Cambodians around the world, it simply makes no sense. The Khmer Rouge would have been undermining their own goals. Plus, Comrade Duch hadn't been arrested yet in 1996. That didn't happen till 1999. Until then, there was no human rights tribunal realistically on the horizon. It was Duch's decision to cooperate with prosecutors and testify that launched it. So, Senior Khmer Rouge had absolutely no motive to assassinate Ngor. So what makes this conspiracy theory so sticky? It's nearly 30 years later, and the idea that the Khmer Rouge killed Ngor lives on in certain circles. I mean, seriously, just the other day, a friend emailed me a short story that ran in the New Yorker magazine in 2020. It was written by Anthony Vyasna, and it's called 3 Women of Chuck's Donuts. It's fiction, but in it, this Cambodian-American author suggests that a Khmer Rouge sympathizer in Los Angeles killed Ngor. That's new fiction that came out 24 years after he died. So why is this theory so sticky? 1, no one believes the LAPD story that Ngor was killed in a botched robbery. 2, and more importantly, I believe the answer is trauma. The overwhelming amount of unprocessed trauma suffered by survivors of the Khmer Rouge now living in Los Angeles, Ngor's second home.
Hi, and welcome to Death in Cambodia, Life in America, a podcast where I interview my father, Robert Chow, one of the
Dorothy Chow is a Khmer American living in San Francisco. She was born in the U.S., but her parents are survivors of the Khmer Rouge. When the pandemic set in, she launched the podcast Death in Cambodia to tell her father, Robert Chow's story of survival. Her mom would still rather not share hers. Dorothy Chow's too young to be in the loop on Haing Ngor. When we spoke, she hadn't even seen the killing fields. But she wasn't surprised when I told her that former refugees, many of whom live in Long Beach, California, thought the Khmer Rouge had assassinated him.
Understand that during the Khmer Rouge, people who were artists and educated people were the first to go. They were the ones that were being targeted during that time, during the Khmer Rouge. So it doesn't really surprise me then that, people within the Long Beach community went to that conclusion.
Soon, this pandemic project became much more. Chow launched Khmer Courageous Conversations. She works with a licensed clinical psychologist to host online support meetings for people like her, first-generation Americans who are also second-generation survivors of the Khmer Rouge.
All these refugees who came in here never had an opportunity to really process whatever happened. And even to this day, as I run the podcast, I get a lot of DMs and messages from other, second-generation Cambodians who say that their grandparents still have nightmares about the Khmer Rouge. I mean, there's very, very much deep trauma that is unprocessed within the community.
I've come to think of this conspiracy theory as the Khmer Rouge misdirect. Survivors of the Khmer Rouge were triggered by the news of Ngor's death. He was a hometown hero, so they became fearful that the Khmer Rouge could still reach them, even overseas. Part of that was the scale of the brutality. Sometimes I think that the Khmer Rouge were like someone threw a rock into a pond. Historically, it wasn't that long ago, and the ripples are still receding. For the record, zero evidence has ever emerged to suggest the Khmer Rouge killed Haing Ngor, no matter what Comrade Duit may have said. But to me, it's obvious that the conspiracy theory undermined a full investigation. Once authorities ruled out a foreign assassination on U.S. soil, the international dimensions of Ngor's life were ignored. His business interests, his business partners, his family, his sex life, his feuds, and the death threats he received. Ngor was bicontinental, with a foot in 2 worlds. He was a movie star who stayed as active as he could in Hollywood to make money. In Cambodia, he was a businessman and a humanitarian, working to rebuild his country in the chaotic landscape of post-conflict Cambodia. Unprocessed trauma will keep showing up in Ngor's story. I believe Ngor's own likely PTSD was a contributing factor to his death. I mentioned in my opening episode there were multiple motives for killing Ngor. I've just eliminated one of them. The Khmer Rouge did not kill him. Of that, I am confident. I hope you'll stick with me as I collaborate with the Innocence Center and try to figure out who did. Once again, if you want the full story of Nick Dunlop, Nate Thayer, and Comrade Duit, take a look at my first season in the 2 episodes called Finding Comrade Duit. It's a story in and of itself. Coming next week, a closer look at Ngor, the human being, by one of the people who knew him best. The audio of Ngor in this episode comes courtesy of Punavision and Punahou Archives at the Punahou School in Honolulu, Hawaii. The combat audio comes from the documentary The Vietnam War and President Nixon's Secret Escalation Strategy through a Creative Commons license on YouTube. My name is Patricia Noonan, and this is Who Killed Haing Ngor. Feel free to reach out by email at whokilledhaingnor@gmail.com.